I seem to have recently been bitten by the diorama bug. We recently went through and built out the small scale, small profile diorama, which I've affectionately for now titled as the Lab. But what if we want to do something a little bit bigger? Well, that's the goal today, because we've got a kit of Kasrkins where we happen to have a few spare men in there lying around for one reason or another. So what we'll do is we will make up a nice display base and a small scene, and we're using the base in the form of some plasticard. So what we need to do is just cut this to size and get to work. To kick everything off, we applied a layer of a sand texture paste to the plastic card, which will dry nicely and give us a really good textured based surface that we can stick our elements down onto. What elements, you ask? Well, we're going to be building out a small temporary base for the Astra Militarum here. We are going to be using some barrels and some boxes from the 40k crates kit, as well as some elements from the Aegis defense barriers. These can all be just snipped off, glued together, and then prepared for our scene. As I said, the scene I'm imagining is a sort of defense base held by the Astra Militarum. I don't want it to be too busy, so on top of the elements like the Aegis defense walls and the crates, we are also going to have some of the Kasrkin. And I'm thinking around 2 or 3 models should be enough that will draw attention to those particular elements, while giving enough space on the rest of the base to breathe. By moving the elements around, we can decide on the rough looks, and if we need to use proxy models for our Kasrkin because they're not built yet, that is possible too. We came to the decision of having the barriers semi-staggered, which will make a few paths of clear view, and then a stack of crates and barrels. We can use some super glue to stick down the barriers at this point, now we know where we want them to be, but the resources, we are going to use some plastic glue in order to stick them together in a pile, which will allow them to be mounted on a painting handle and then glued to the base after we're finished with them. We can now start to texture the base as the walls are glued down and secure. To do this, we're going to start with a coat of sand texture paste, the same as we used to initially prime the surface of our board. We can go through and vary the thickness of this across the scene, which will give us varying textures. Once this is down, but still wet and drying, we can add some harsher texture by taking some small gravelly sand and sprinkling it across the bases. We want more texture primarily in a certain area. We're focusing around the walls, so we're sprinkling more of the textured gravelly sand in that area. Generally, we're not using the sand texture paste because it's a relatively strong acrylic medium that's in there. I tend to find that we don't need to do much more in regards to securing the textured, rough, harsh sand than just sprinkling it down and letting it bond with the acrylic. But if we are slightly concerned that there may be some movement, some shifting, because we will be doing things like dry brushing a bit later on, what we could do is come in and use some thinned down PVA, apply that across all of the elements of sand, and then once that's dry, there'll be that additional layer of security holding them down. But if you're not too concerned of a couple of stray stones coming off, then we're going to be continuing as this is, and saves the time of letting PVA glue set, cure, and dry. At this point, I decided that the area opposite the resources is a little bit bland, so what we decided to do was make up a device which could be utilised in the field. Here, we're using a mining laser, which we stole from the Genestealer Cult combat patrol. To make the mining laser, naturally, we need to build the laser as per the instructions in the kit. It's a nice 2-part thing that we just put together. But the more interesting element here is the framing and the mounting. Naturally, there isn't a mount for external use of a mining laser. So to achieve this, we needed to take the external frames from the Ridge Rider kit, which we chose not to use when we built that model itself. By cutting the rods into sections, because they're mirrored, they are able to be glued together, giving us a nice frame, similar to the power armor holder from Fallout. That's what it reminds me of anyway. We can then go around and add a few other components and bits and bobs just to fill out the frame and make it look slightly more technological. And then we can push it into the sand texture paste, and later on we can mount the laser, because for now it's going onto a painting handle. This does leave some key areas of building. We've got most of the Kasrkins, in fact all of the Kasrkins that we need to build, but I've decided that as well as the 3 Kasrkin models that we're building out for the kit, we're going to build out an extra model. And I'm not going to go over the full building of the Kasrkin or this extra model because it's just following the kit instructions, except we blue tacked certain elements together rather than gluing it, so that we can take them off and paint them in sub-assemblies. However, with the additional model that I'm adding at this point, we do need to go back slightly. We're going to the Astra Militarum Combat Patrol, where they've got mortars. And on those kits, there are people sitting ready to fire the mortars. We did not use those models. And now I'm using one of them now. So what we're going to do is build that model as per the kit, but make one minor addition, which I think will just add a little bit of flavour to this scene that we're building. As mentioned, we built out the sitting figure as per the instructions within the Combat Patrol. But we chose one hand to be used specifically. In fact, there is a hand where there is a signal or a salute being made or given. We want to take this and then mount it into a little bit of blue tack to give us some firm grounding, and then grab a thin drill bit. We're going to start to drill into the finger gap. This will then have a small pin added in to the hole that we've made and glued in with super glue. This gives us a really, really nice small scale cigarette, giving us a sitting model, having a fag, which we can mount onto our boxes or our barrels later on. We can then take all of these elements out to be primed, including the rest of the soldiers that we will have already built. For the priming, we actually varied this a little bit depending on what it was we were painting at the time. For everything like the men, the barrels, the crates, and the mining laser, we actually just gave them a zenithal prime, going from a black base coat up to that white zenithal top coat. But then we have the other elements like the base itself, and this was handled a little bit differently. First off, we came in with a black spray to prime the Aegis defense barriers and also try and catch the frame that we've made and now installed onto the base. Once that was down, what we then did is grabbed a brown spray and then tried to aim this hitting predominantly the ground and the dirt and everything like that, avoiding the Aegis defense barrier that we've just sprayed black because we want that black, not brown. Once we've got the brown down and all of that is dry, so we've got black barriers and brown ground, we're then going to cover it with a white zenithal, giving us that nice brightness that we can build off in the next few steps. We can start off painting the base by grabbing a large brush, and what we're going to do is apply a coat of brown wash across all of the sand and dirt areas. This will take a little bit of time to dry, but once it has, we can add in some variation, which we can achieve through grabbing some washes in various hues. Here we are going to be opting to use a blue, a green and a red wash. And we can spread these across the base in various areas, allowing some of these washes to mix in certain elements of the base as well, just giving us that little bit of nuance within the floor. We can then start dry brushing once it's all dry. And we're going to be starting from a camo green and then apply a few light coats of this in a dry brushing manner. The intention here is to tint the majority of the base, but still allow for our wash tints in the last step to show through. We can then start to follow this up with another dry brush, this time coming in with ivory. We will be hitting the entirety of the base lightly, but we are going to be focusing more on the rocky texture we made by picking out all of the gravelly textured stones that we sprinkled on earlier. We can then finish off the ground and harmonize the whole area by reapplying a wash, but this time we're coming in with a black wash, which will darken everything down and give us a nice cohesive ground with elements of nuance. This black wash also has the advantage of naturally darkening down the base, and this is good because we want the focus to be on our models, which we're going to be painting slightly brighter, and we don't want the attention to be on the ground and the dirt. So by painting that darker and having our troops slightly lighter, we are able to deal with that in a nice way and have the attention drawn to our troops. But before we get to painting our troops, we do need to finish off the base by painting up the Aegis barriers as well as our mining laser frame. We can achieve this by first taking a black contrast and applying this across all of the elements. As we will be going for a metal paint job, the black works really well here as a base. Once the contrast rebasing is complete and dry, we can dig out our metals and start to get to work. We are going to start from a dark, warm gold. Using a stubby round brush, we can go around and stipple this across all of the areas that we want metal. We want this to be rather heavy, leaving the black only showing through in the recesses and a couple of areas we haven't been able to hit. In order to boost some brightness into the paint job, we will need to come back in and do another stippling round, But this time we want it to be slightly lighter in application as well as in hue brightness. This time we're going to be coming in with a brassy gold and focusing our stippling on more of the edges and central panels. This will give us a really nice bright gold barricade, but as we know, we darkened down the ground because we didn't want it to be overly bright and attracting the eye. And now we have bright gold barricade. So we're going to be dealing with that in a really quick and easy way. And that's dry brushing. So we want to grab a nice large round dry brush and then grab some dark metals or dark silvers, and we can start the next steps. Now with a bristle load of metal paint, we can start to work around the elements. And as I said, this time we are dry brushing and not stippling. So we're going to give everything a nice dark silver dry brushing. Naturally, this will catch all of the edges and corners more than it will catch any of the flat areas. And it will instantly start to add that slightly worn look. But we are not finished yet. We want to move across to a more medium silver and then repeat the dry brushing. This time, however, we are going to be focusing on using mostly downward facing strokes in order to represent the light impact on the metals and the barricades. We want to leave this to dry 100%, fully dry, completely dry, bone dry. And that's because we are going to be coming in with the next stage of applying a dirty green wash. And we're going to apply this coat of dirty green wash across all of the metals, which will knock back some of the shine initially out of our metals, while also nicely shading and tinting the work that we've done so far. This wash is the main reason that we want to be 100% sure that the metal paints that we've applied has cured. Because otherwise what will happen is we'll end up picking up some of the metallic pigments and the flakes within the paint, and it will be picked up, moved around and deposited in an unwanted place by our wash. This is also how we get a lot of things happening in regards to when you look at a wash pot and there's for some reason metal flakes floating around in your Nuln oil or something like that. It's normally because you've gone in and washed something like a metal while the metal isn't fully dry. So the paintbrush has then wicked up some of that released metal pigment, which has then gone straight back into the wash pot. So that's what tends to cause it, and we're going to avoid that by making sure it is 100% dry. Once our wash is 100% dry, we can come in with a medium silver, and we're going to add a little bit of shine and show that we care about our base as much as we do our models. So with a medium silver and a round brush, we can start to pick out various elements on the barriers. Predominantly, we want to pick out the symbology, so highlighting the eagle in a broad highlight manner, as well as picking out the nuts and bolts and bullet holes. This leaves us with a little bit of tinting to be undertaken. For the symbology, we want to grab a dark yellow contrast and apply this over the eagle, whereas we want to take a black wash to all of the metal bolts that we highlighted. Just a drop on each should give us a nice little recess shade and slightly matte out the shine from our metal. Beyond that, there's some small optional areas like picking out wires and panels on the insides of the walls in a black or other preferred colour. Now, we have spent a fair amount of time on the base itself and it's looking really good. We do have some elements still left to paint. We've got the barrels, the crates, as well as the mining laser. But before we do those, because we can tackle them in a really quick and efficient way using a few tricks, we're first going to switch up gears and paint up the brave soldiers that are protecting or using this base in the form of the Kasrkin. We can start off with the fatigues, and for this we are going to start with a base coat of a medium green muddy brown tone. And this can then be applied across the entirety of the fabrics, potentially over a couple of coats, until we have a complete coverage in a nice consistent colour. From here, we are going to start the highlighting. This is going to be in multiple thinner coats, slowly building up from our base coat hue up to a green ochre. We will eventually get to a mix which is almost pure green ochre as opposed to any of our base coat colour. And by this point we should be laying down relatively broad highlights, mapping out the overall highlight paths and pulling our mid-tone into this ochre hue, leaving the shadows in more of our base coat tone. Once this is achieved, we can start to mix a little bit of ivory into our greenish ochre, giving us a brighter, paler ochre tone. and then this can be used to build out our highlights. We will be following the past broader highlight rounds, slowly bringing up the brightness of the fabrics, focusing on the brightest parts and the edges. With this done, we can move to the painting of the Kasrkin's carapace armor. And we are going for a box art style paint job here, but we're not going to be going for the orange flared patterns that are on the green carapace, but just going for that nice green military looking armor. And we're going to be painting this up over a few layers. So let's start off, and naturally we are going to be needing a green. We will be starting from a dark green base coat, and we want to thin this down slightly and then apply multiple coats until we have, similar to the fabrics, a complete full coverage coat of a dark green. With this achieved and the base coat down and dry, we can start doing the highlighting and mid-toning. This is achieved by mixing a little bit of yellow green into our base coat green and starting up with that highlight process. We're going to be applying layers over a few thinner coats, mixing more and more of our highlight in as we go. This will bring up the overall armor color and give us a nice rich mid-tone before we move to tackle the highlights. The start of the highlights will be the use of some pure yellow-green, and this will be applied in a relatively broad edge highlight, which will pick out all of the edges, but also broaden the highlights at the brightest points. We're actually going to be pushing our greens a little bit further. We've now hit our essential highlight color, which was the yellowish green that we used in our mix, but as I said, pushing it a little bit further here in 2 more stages. First of all, what we're going to do is add a brighter color, but we're not going to be using a green. We're going to go for the green ochre, which was also featured in our fabrics. This helps to tie those colors slightly together because the same colors semi-present in each part of the model, but it also has a benefit of slightly lightening and brightening up and richening up our green highlight. Without adding a vibrant green, it's making it more of a sun-like highlight. But because we don't want it to be such a bright and jumpy transition, what we're going to actually do is make a first stage, which is to take our base coat green, our highlight green, as well as our ochre color, and then mix those together for our first fine highlight before we get on to our final highlight. This mix consists of 3 colors. As we said, we have a small amount of our initial base coat color, a tiny amount more of the yellow greeny ochre, and then a large portion of the mix is being made up of our yellowy green highlight tone. We can take this mix and start to work around the model, giving all of the green armor elements a nice thin edge highlight. This will give us some nice definition on the model before we start to make up another mix. This time, we are not going to be using our base coat green. This will give us a slightly brighter version of the color we've just used, and we can take this as the brightest hue and then go around and spot edge highlight, picking out the edges on the brightest points, meaning that we have the armor done and we can move on to some various accessories. And we are going to be kicking all of these elements off with a nice re-base coating in a black contrast. Similar to the walls earlier, this works really well for anything like metals, but also we're going to be opting for black as the secondary color for our weapons and accessories. Naturally, these will need highlighting later on. Yes, we will be highlighting boots, we will be highlighting pouches, and all those small minor accessories, especially highlighting belts, because that is fun and important. But before we get to all of the highlighting of the blacks, we're actually going to be dealing with all of the metals. And here it's just a case of going around and picking out what elements you want as your black secondary color and what elements you want as the gold metallics. So we just picked out certain things. Naturally, I wanted all of the badges, emblems, and symbology to be in a gold. So I used that first as a kind of guiding area, using blacks next to our golds so that we had a nice spread of golds and blacks across the model. Metal-wise, we are starting with the same dark warm gold that we used on our barriers, but rather than going round and stippling, this time we are going to be applying complete coverage layers. This will work really well for a base coat, and we can then move to our brighter, brassier gold and use this to edge highlight all of the metal elements. We will be coming back to these later on, but while we wait for all of our metals to fully dry, we can highlight our lovely blacks. And in order to do this, we are going to mix a little bit of light flesh into the initial black contrast that we used. This will slightly thicken up the contrast and hopefully make a relatively good consistency for our highlights in a dark, subtle grey, warm tone. We are going to be mainly applying edge highlights. This will add some warm definition to the areas. When doing this, we want to make sure not to catch too much of the area with our highlight colour. We still want the shadows and the mid-tone to be in the contrast black. So we are essentially just picking out the highlights with this colour. Personally, I find the idea of mixing our contrast in with the highlight colour a very quick and easy way of achieving a nice black. We do just want to make sure that we're hitting the highlights, as I said. Don't paint in the midtones in the grey because then it looks grey and not black. But as long as we're using contrast as the base coat, we know that the deep recesses are going to be really, really black because that's how contrast works. The main surface is going to be just kind of a normal black because we're using a dense contrast. And then we can go in and do our highlight on the very edge, giving us that nice variation with 80% of the area basically being still black. So it looks as black when we look at the model. It reads as black, which is what we want. However, we will want to slightly tamp back the highlight a little bit, as well as adding some definition. And we're going to be using a black wash for this. And the wash is the reason that we painted the metals earlier before we painted the black, as these will also be getting a coat of this black wash. We want to work around the model, giving all of the metal and black areas a light coat of this wash. This leaves really only the minor elements that didn't really fall into any other category. Things like grenades. To break these up from the rest of the elements, we opted for a different method entirely, going for a light green metallic as a base coat. Then once this was dry, we applied a decent coat of a red wash, which will shade the colour but also sap some of the saturation out of the green, giving us a nice nuanced metallic grenade. For any of the buttons or lights across the models, we grabbed a glossy white and then used this to dot all of the elements that we wanted to have a bright reflective light, giving us this bright reflective base coat. We can then follow that up with our bright glossy red wash, which is a technical paint of the gemstone variety from GW. We can apply this to the white in order to tint them into red light, which will stand out really nice against the majority green of the model. Now, all but the heads of the men, that solves our Kasrkin. They're essentially all painted up. We will be painting the heads later on, but obviously you can paint the heads in any skin tone you want, so there's a lot of options there. However, we still have some elements of the base left to paint. We've got the accessories, we've got the mining laser, the barrels, as well as the crates, and they're all painted in a very similar way. But we are going to be starting from a zenithal. And similar to most things, when we're applying a zenithal, what we want is most of the white to be in the direct looking point from where the sun would be hitting. This will give us a nice light map of areas that should be darker versus areas that should be lighter. And we're going to be kicking things off with contrast paints. We are going to be covering the crates here, but we did exactly the same process on the barrels and the mining laser. It's just a case of a different shape. So what we're going to be starting off with is a dark red contrast. And we use this to get a nice base coat of red on all of the elements that we wanted red. In this case, we're painting the larger crates red, while we're painting the smaller crates in a green contrast. For the green contrast, we made up a mix from a yellow and blue contrast paint set, and then we used this green contrast on the crates. Once the first round of contrast is dry, what we want to do is grab an ivory and then use this to highlight all of the elements really, really quickly through the application of dry brushing. Dry brushing will pick out all of the edges and brightest surface panels in a nice warm off-white. With this done, we can then start to re-tint all of the highlights back to the colours that we want. For the red, we took a brighter red contrast, diluted it slightly with contrast mix, and then coated the red crates. While we did the same thing for the green crates, except we made up a slightly lighter mix of green, diluting it before we covered the crates. That really only leaves things like the symbology on the crates and one final step. And I'm not going to go over the repainting of the symbology, and mainly because we painted it exactly the same way as how we painted the eagles on the Aegis defense barrier. So I'm not going to rehash something that we've already covered, because we've already done it. Just use your dark bronzier gold and your brassy gold as your highlight, and we're all good. There is one more step that we need to do though, which is to take a dirty green camo wash and then apply that across all of the elements. What this is going to do is help to tint and reinforce and recess shade everything that is painted green, while everything that's painted red is going to be made looking slightly dirtier, as well as giving us that nice recess shade as well. All we need to do is make sure that we go around and don't allow too much pooling, because then we'll get really unsightly tidal marks across all of the nice paint jobs that we've done so far. With that said, let's finish off our Kasrkin now by taking our heads and a fine brush. What we want to do is carefully apply a dark, warm flesh as a base coat. For the heads with masks and things like that, we just want to be really careful and pick out only the skin elements. We can then build out some of the brightness through mixing a lighter flesh tone into our base coat, and then using this to pick out most of the areas like the forehead, the cheeks, the nose and the jaw, leaving the shadowy skin base coat in the recesses, and this mix as more of our mid-tone. We can then start to highlight by taking a pale pastel pink and mixing this into our last mix. This can then be used as a highlight, focusing on the sharpest, pointiest areas, things like the nose, the cheeks and the brow. This leaves us with the eyes, and if up to this point we have been able to keep them white, we should have a nice easy target where we can come in and try to dot a small amount of black contrast. But what we can do then is, if you're feeling lucky and you're up to the challenge, we can then grab a white and use this to add a small dot in the center of the black, trying to make it look like the eyes are looking in the same direction. We then just had essential small elements that we needed to finish off. This is things like the mouth. And all we did here was we took the white when we were dotting the eyes, quickly kind of overbrushed it around the mouth and the lips and the teeth, and then went in with a red wash just to give us that red mouth-like mouth colour, the red mouth colour. Essentially, we got from a red wash, dropped over some white, and it sorted it out nicely. In regards to the eyes, there is one thing that I just wanted to point out if you're having difficulty painting small elements, specifically eyes and things like that, because we actually managed to get some eyes that came out okay on these models. And the only way that I can ever achieve that is with magnifiers, which I use for pretty much all of my painting. But I have double stack magnifiers, which allow me to still vary the focal range a little bit while getting increasingly strong magnification. And that's the only way that I can paint eyes and pupils and things like that, because otherwise I have no hope of seeing them. So if you're potentially struggling with things like painting eyes or small details, even though there's allegedly a stigma around wearing these in the hobby where we paint small plastic men, and there's even worse stigmas around that than there should be around using goggles, I would suggest potentially picking up a pair and seeing if they help it out. With that all said, the faces are done, the men are done, and the bases are done. All we have to do is stick them all together and we can get them into the show reel. Here we go, a medium-sized diorama made over the course of 4 to 5 days. And yes, as always, I'm biased, but I do really like this. We have a nice spread of detail and nuance. We have a selection of guardsmen. Our man at the front is looking for targets. Behind him, there is a barrier, and behind that barrier, there is another Kasrkin using a device to potentially scan for nearby enemies or control the mining laser that he's next to. And of course, we have our leader looking back, hand extended and shouting, perhaps because he's seen the guardsman resting up against those Promethean barrels having a quick cigarette. It's important to remember that careless smoking can kill. Now, as it might be obvious, I had a lot of fun on this project. I think it came out really, really well. Yes, I put the work in, so I'm slightly biased, but all of those caveats have already been highlighted. I love how this came out. And as I said at the very beginning, it was inspired by the recent diorama we did over Christmas. We made a low profile, small diorama scene. I refer to it, as I said, as currently as the lab. And if you want to see how we made that, why not check out the video here? Otherwise, do remember to subscribe so that we can see you next time.